After all we've seen and all we've heard these last 3 weeks, are there new limits to what we can say? And that's where we're going for the rest of this broadcast. There is no particular courage involved in telling the truth, for example, if you know from the outset that what you're saying is widely accepted and almost universally applauded. You should still do it, of course, but it doesn't require courage. It's when you know that there'll be hell to pay that telling the truth gets tough. I say that by way of introduction because truth, at least, carries some weight of its own. It is a legal shield, for example, against a charge of slander or libel. But what about an unpopular opinion, which may or may not have the additional virtue of being true? We revel in the self-image of a people free and unafraid to say what's on our minds. It is part of the profile that we sketch to define an American. And yet, in times of crisis, times like these, we narrow the range of opinions that we would like to hear. We trumpet the virtue of our freedoms, even as some, in the name of patriotism, move to restrict them. Here's Nightline correspondent John Donvan.
Go back for a moment to September 11th. The attack had just happened. We were still deeply in shock. The facts, how this happened, who did it, who survived, and who is missing, those facts were not fact yet. We did not know the answers. We were scared. We were praying. And at that very moment, imagine you're sitting at a university history class somewhere, and your professor says the following: anyone who can blow up the Pentagon has my vote. Well, that actually happened. The school was the University of New Mexico, and the professor is named Richard Berthold, and he has since apologized. But the school is weighing a disciplinary action against him nevertheless.
And what was that? Free speech? Or, given the context, was it just an incredibly out-of-line insult to the dead and missing at the Pentagon crash site? Or what if, just supposing now, some of the students in that classroom had a friend or relative working at the Pentagon who was still unaccounted for? In that context, would the professor's remark be free speech or a verbal assault that should be punished?
For the land of the free.
We know that since September 11th, the times have changed. There is a new context for everything. Fear and anger are part of it, but so is a sense that we are all in this together, and that, for many, has been uplifting. The question, the hard question is, in times like these, what happens when someone does not want to sing with the chorus?
God bless us.
Because there is dissent, and occasionally it makes it into the headlines, and very often it is simply a message of peace.
A lot of innocent people are going to die, and I think there's a better way to handle the situation.
But to some Americans, a march like this against the president's stated aims is somehow suspect, unpatriotic, because it is breaking ranks, when what we need is strength, which comes from unity. And unity is in the flag, and in standing behind our leaders no matter who they are. And so you can read the president's poll numbers, an approval rating of about 90%, as evidence of that majority view.
Mr. Speaker.
And you can look at Congress and the way it began cooperating with the White House and applauding the president from the moment of the attack, quickly granting him the power to use force.
My valued colleague from California, Ms. Lee.
But then we know that one Congresswoman, Barbara Lee, voted against that use of force resolution because she had doubts.
September 11th changed the world. Our deepest fears now haunt us. Yet I am convinced that military action will not prevent further acts of international terrorism against the United States. This is a very complex and complicated matter.
And you can disagree with her, but can you really applaud the price she had to pay? Death threats so serious, she then needed extra security at her Capitol Hill office.
Of course, that was an extreme reaction to Congresswoman Lee's vote. Most Americans do not make death threats, even if they hate someone's point of view. And the government itself provided the security she needed. But there have been times in our history when the government did not come to the aid of a dissenting voice. Quite the contrary.
1798, the nation was young, And in a time of tension with France, laws were passed called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it illegal to criticize the government. 1918, the First World War, it was illegal to speak out against President Woodrow Wilson or the war itself. 1940, on the eve of World War II, the Smith Act was passed, making it illegal to speak in favor of overthrowing the U.S. government. And in the 1950s, Senator Joe McCarthy, who bullied people for years.
This is what democracy looks like.
It happened whenever there was a threat. And yet today, as we have seen, again at a time of threat, people are protesting, and without government interference. Protest today is legal, and in fact the right to protest is protected by the government.
Credit that to America's prosperity and growing self-confidence. Not only did the government, for all intents and purposes, step out of the way of free speech, but society became more tolerant of speech than ever before. There was sex in commercials, jokes about Jesus on the internet, art exhibits that caused dismay but stayed open. There were limits, however. Insult a minority or make a sexist remark, and you could lose your job for that, but that wasn't government pressure. That was social pressure, or as it's sometimes called, political correctness. Ironic that it was on ABC's late-night show, Politically Incorrect, that we might have just witnessed social pressure again to change the rules on what is now acceptable speech. The discussion included the conservative commentator Dinesh D'Souza, who was arguing we might be underestimating the terrorists by portraying them as cowards. The following exchange set off a huge backlash against host Bill Maher.
We have been the cowards, lobbing cruise missiles from 2,000 miles away. That's cowardly.
That is
Staying in the airplane when it hits the building. Say what you want about it, not cowardly. You're right.
Immediately, Maher's sponsors, Sears and Federal Express, pulled their advertising. 17 stations dropped the program, including the ABC station here in Washington, which wrote to the Washington Post, "The First Amendment also gives WJLA the right to broadcast what it deems appropriate." Bill Maher went out and apologized.
This idea that I somehow made it worse fills me with remorse and regret.
But D'Souza, who had sparked that exchange, believes people may be overreacting.
I think that there is, particularly at a time of tension, a tendency to jump the gun and a tendency to react too harshly. Part of it, I think, is people's frustration at the elusive enemy. It's difficult to, grab the terrorists or their surrogates and yell and scream and get at them. And so in some ways, some of that frustration, I think, is being vented against Bill Maher.
To believe in things.
But Maher at least still has his job. That is not true of everybody who has broken with the chorus.
When people are hurting and angry, frustration is a natural result. When we come back, John Donvan focuses on the blame game. What is often overlooked in ordinary times suddenly looms much larger in times of crisis. John Donvan continues his report.
Welcome again to Politically Incorrect.
Bill Maher's remarks on Politically Incorrect caused one kind of controversy. Here were some others. Jerry Falwell blaming the terrorist attack on American morals.
The pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen.
And on radio, Louisiana Congressman John Cooksey's views on foreigners.
I don't care what their race is or what their religion is. But I can tell you this. If I see someone that comes in that's got a diaper on his head and a fan belt around his diaper on his head, that guy needs to be pulled over and checked.
All three of these incidents achieved scandal proportions, and it wasn't long before the White House was asked to comment on Cooksey.
The president was very disturbed by those remarks.
On Falwell, the White House called his remarks inappropriate, and on Bill Maher.
Assuming the press reports are right, it's a terrible thing to say, and it's unfortunate. They're reminders to all Americans that they need to watch what they say, watch what they do, and this is not a time for remarks like that. There never is.
All three men who made those remarks ended up expressing regret. None of them raised a free speech or First Amendment defense of their comments. On the other hand, that professor in New Mexico who made the flip remark about how he'd be in favor of bombing the Pentagon, he is raising the free speech issue.
I wish I had expressed some noble criticism of my government's policies, and this was swirling around that. It was a pathetic and insensitive attempt at a joke, but I believe the First Amendment protects the fools in society, as well as the people expressing noble sentiments.
Berthold may have some grounds for fighting back. The university is government funded, and government entities are bound to respect the First Amendment. In a statement, however, the university says its concern is whether or not he has failed to carry out his professional responsibility to his students. Newspaper columnists, on the other hand, work for private companies, and the First Amendment offers them no protection from being fired. When Texas City Sun columnist Tom Gutting published a piece suggesting President Bush was hiding on September 11th and wrote, quote, "He's not a leader, he's a puppet, and it has never been more apparent," readers like restaurant owner Kevin Yackley were appalled.
The way it was written, it was slanderous to the president.
And the paper's own publisher wrote a piece of his own, calling most of Gutting's opinions, quote, "so absurd they don't even merit a response. May God bless President George W. Bush and other leaders." And then Tom Gutting was out of a job.
It was a real surprise to me when he came and got me and sat me down in his office and said to me, he just said, I don't think we can work productively together anymore. And he declined to give any reasons for that, and he said I couldn't change his mind.
In Oregon, this column got Dan Guthrie fired from the Grants Pass Daily Courier. President Bush skedaddled on September 11th, he wrote, and the picture of Bush hiding in a Nebraska hole becomes an embarrassment.
Newspapers are more than money machines. They have entered into a covenant with the First Amendment. And here the publisher and presumably the owner broke that covenant.
And Ann Coulter lost her position with the conservative National Review Online after a dispute with management. It began with a column in which she wrote of the terrorists, "We should invade their countries, kill their leaders, and convert them to Christianity." When her next column was spiked, Coulter cried foul.
People are afraid to say anything now. I mean, they're jumping down people. We're repealing the First Amendment without a law.
Everybody's
and then
sitting up here tonight.
She was gone.
So it's not just attacking George Bush that can get you in trouble. It's also attacking America's perceived enemies the wrong way, because the argument goes things just are not the same as before.
Ann Coulter's editor at National Review was Jonah Goldberg.
Jonah, wasn't Ann Coulter originally hired because of her rather fiery rhetorical style?
Absolutely. We ran her column because Ann Coulter is a bomb thrower.
What tolerant part of Islam?
But the fact is that times have changed since September 11th. What I see is we're entering into an age, I don't know how long this age is going to be, but we're entering into a period where all of a sudden Americans, especially journalists, are realizing once again that words matter. That what you say matters and how you say it matters.
But that's not the same thing as moving in lockstep with the president, and none of the media outlets who have fired people advocates that. As for Congress, it's not necessarily going to hand the president everything he wants either. This week, Senator Robert Byrd, whose patriotism, as far as we can tell, has never been questioned, stood up and made an argument for, well, if not dissent exactly, then debate.
Yes, we want to respond quickly to urgent needs, but a speedy response should not be used as an excuse to trample full and free debate.
One final point on news organizations and their employees. Papers have a right to fire whomever they want, and if they do it out of the principle that a newspaper or TV station needs to be sensitive to community concerns, that is also their right. If, however, writers are fired because their bosses are scared of losing ads or readers, well, that's legal too. It's just not as clear that any high principle is involved. I'm John Donvan for Nightline in Washington.
When we come back, what are the limits of free speech? We'll have a roundtable of opinions, including one columnist who got fired for criticizing the president. The freedom to criticize government or make politically incorrect comments at a time of crisis. We have a range of views tonight, from novelist and essayist Susan Sontag, who joins us from our New York studio. Here in Washington, Todd Graziano, director of the Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation, and Republican strategist and lobbyist Ed Gillespie. And joining us from Houston, Tom Gutting, the former city editor of the Texas City Sun, fired after he wrote that column criticizing President Bush. And Tom, since you're the only guy here without a job at the moment, I should come to you first. What's your impression? Why were you fired? Because of what you said, or because of the reaction of people in the community, most especially advertisers and subscribers?
Well, I think it's pretty safe to say that if there hadn't been the public outcry from readers, that I'd still have my job.
Ed Gillespie, do you think that's okay?
I think that's the prerogative of the newspaper, and the columnist obviously has a right to express his views. Readers have a right to say we don't like those views, and we may change our allegiance to another paper or another news outlet, and the publisher is free to then make a change at the newspaper in response to that commercial reaction.
Susan Sontag, you wrote a brief piece in the New Yorker in which you also expressed an opinion that was very close to the one that was voiced by Bill Maher on the program Politically Incorrect. What kind of reaction did you get from readers?
Well, I got very positive reactions from hundreds of people who wrote to me, but I actually don't think that my position was the same as Bill Maher's. I did, in passing, mention that I thought the word cowardly was kind of pointless word to sling around, but it was part of a much larger argument that this sort of build-up of moralistic words to describe this horrendous atrocity was not helping us to understand and reach an intelligent response, political and military, which I'm absolutely in favor of. I'm not a pacifist. But I'd like to return to the point that was made by Mr. Gillespie about the newspaper serving its readers if they object to what Tom Gutting said. I think a newspaper might very well serve its readers by reminding American readers that one of the things that makes us care more about this country than any other place is we stand for great tolerance of diversity, heterodoxy, and divergence, debate, and dissent. I don't identify dissent and debate. I think they are two different things. And that also is a duty of a newspaper to its readers. It's serving its readers by upholding these standard American values.
Susan, I don't know the publisher of the newspaper, but I'm sure he would agree with that assessment, as do I. That doesn't mean, however, that we all have a right to churn out copy that is, frankly, I think was just erroneous in judgment. The president certainly is not a puppet here. The journalist is and the columnist is free to say that. I'm free to disagree with that. And I think that there are certain lines where you say, you know, this is not a matter of quashing dissent. It's a question of judgment and value judgment here.
Yeah, but there's so many opinions around, and I guess I'm just a very straight First Amendment, strict First Amendment person.
You're also a very offensive writer.
Hold on just a second. Let's get Todd Graziano in here from.
I'd like to defend Ann Coulter just as much as I want to defend Tom Gutting.
But I don't think anyone can defend you, Susan. Listen, you misrepresented what was most offensive about your column. You are part of the Blame America First crowd. You said that we were to blame for our foreign policy, that the 6,000 dead.
I said nothing of the kind.
You certainly did, and Charles Krauthammer called you on it,
well,
and now
you're trying
to hold it, folks. Just one second, Todd.
I'm sorry, I never said anything of the kind. Believe me, I'm just as patriotic and against the terrorists.
Well, your version of patriotism is rather strange.
Todd, hold on one second.
Look, it's in writing. I didn't say
Susan,
that. I don't blame anybody but the terrorists.
I would like to find out, since Todd Graziano is accusing you of having said something, I'm sure that you have gone to the trouble of getting the quote. It was a very short piece. What precisely is it that you think Susan wrote that draws you to that conclusion?
Well,
you want to take a minute to find it?
Sure.
All right. Then while we're doing that, Tom Gutting, let me come back to you. Has anyone come to you and offered you a job since then?
No, no one has. I'm looking, but it's kind of a tight job market. But one thing, Ted, though, I think that we're overlooking and we're kind of getting bogged down and missing some of the really big issues here. Well, you can disagree or agree with what I wrote, and I freely admit that I might very well have been wrong with what I wrote, and I almost hope that maybe I was, because I'd like to see America triumph here. One thing that's really important to remember is that newspapers, the debate is the lifeblood of a democracy. And newspapers and the media play a very special role in that. It's sort of the circulatory system of the body politic. And if we start squashing the opinions, even if they may be off base, and we start falling in line and not having the debate go on, I think we're in a danger of lessening our democracy and putting our country in a really precarious position.
Absolutely, Ted, but let's note something here that's very important. Tom Gutting is not sitting in jail right now. He's sitting in a television studio. He's talking about his column. He's airing his views. He's dissenting from the newspaper from which he was released. That is democracy.
Let me just go back to Todd Gaziano. Have you had a chance to find the offensive quote?
Right. This is what Susan Sontag wrote in the New Yorker magazine. And it's rather amazing to me that the New Yorker magazine would agree to publish this. She said,
"Oh my goodness,
that the terrorist." Susan, I didn't interrupt you. She said that the terrorist attack, quote, was a consequence of specific American alliances and actions. How many citizens are aware of the ongoing American bombing of Iraq? I think it speaks for itself. You are deigning, in your elitist liberal outlook, to say that we deserved this terrorist attack because of our foreign policy, because of our bombing of Iraq. Blame America. Blame America.
Oh, dear. Absolutely not. That's garbage. This is a historic event, and it has politics behind it. It's not a civilizational struggle only, although it also is that. I'm interested in people having a historical understanding of where we are so that we can better defend ourselves and stop international
terrorism. And let's
terrorism.
get into your position. If we help Muslims in Kuwait...
Hold on 1 second, if you will, because we have to take a short break. And when we come back, what I'd like each of you to address is not so much whether any of these arguments about what was said can be resolved, but whether the Republic as a whole is better served when arguments like this are allowed to flourish or allowed to be out there, or whether in fact we would, any one of us, suggest that they be suppressed. More with our guests in a moment. We're discussing the limits of free speech during a time of crisis with Susan Sontag, Todd Gaziano, Ed Gillespie, and Tom Gutting. And Todd Gaziano, the question, at least the one I'd like you to address, is not whether you agree or disagree with what Susan Sontag said, but whether you defend her right to be published as saying it.
I not only defend her right, I'm glad that she's exposed herself. That's one of the values of the First Amendment. A much wider audience is exposed to the idiocy of Susan Sontag so that we can properly condemn her. There has never been such a clear distinction between good and evil. And those who blame America should be criticized harshly and should not be permitted, to speak in honorable intellectual circles again.
Whoa, that last part is the only part of what you've said that bothers me, but I'll let Susan Sontag respond.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say they shouldn't be permitted. They should, but they should be, properly discounted in the future for their crazy views.
Susan?
This is also preposterous. It's not worth replying to. I'd like to raise the larger issue of debate in this country, in this marvelous country with its political traditions. War has always been debated in this country. The Civil War was hotly debated in this country. We had an election in 1864 at the height of the Civil War, in which Lincoln was very much criticized in the North. The Spanish-American War, First World War, even the Second World War. I'm old enough to remember all the insults and foul epithets that were hurled at Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Second World War. Let's not even mention the Vietnam War afterward. We have a long tradition of debate, and we are a contentious people. I'm very interested in continuing to support that possibility of debate and making things seem more rather than less complicated. I hate it when patriotism is identified with closing down ideas to a couple of set cliches. I think we're very strong, and we should be supporting that tradition.
We also have a tradition, as John Donvan reminded us in the setup pieces to this conversation, we also have a tradition of, at times, breaking some of those democratic traditions, and in times of crisis, cracking down a lot harder than we do at other times. And my question to all of you, and I'm going to begin with you, Ed Gillespie, is whether you feel there is anything about the current crisis that should cause us to diminish the free exchange of ideas. This is not the question of whether a publisher or a broadcaster has the right to fire anyone he pleases. Should there be anything that diminishes the exchange of ideas?
No, Ted, there shouldn't. I agree with President Bush, who said in his joint session speech that our freedoms are under attack. In that instance, our first response should not be to abandon our freedoms, it's to stand by them. The only thing I would say, and I think that the media, I think, would mostly agree with this, which is that there should not be reporting of any kind that undermines the safety of an operation of a military response, or that puts at risk the lives of American servicemen or women. But beyond that, I think you should be free to have guests on your show who express views with which I don't agree. I should be free from my home with my remote control to turn that TV off or to change it to another channel. But in terms of government controls and prescriptions against freedom of speech, I don't agree with that.
Tom Gutting.
Well, I think Ed makes a good point that we should always be open to all different points of view, because after all, what was this country founded on? And it was these great principles of freedom of speech and these rights that our citizens have. But I think that in these times of crisis, particularly this time, because this is the one of my lifetime, we start to equate sort of trading different things for security. So I think we're wrong to equate maybe cracking down on airline safety and searching bags and having increased airline safety with turning in some of our rights for freedom of speech. And I think that's a wrong assumption. We can't give up our fundamental rights during a time like this. Now, you might be able to restrict freedom of movement a little bit, but if we start compromising in any way such a fundamental right like the freedom of speech and start belittling the importance of debate, we're just belittling our democracy. And I think if we start to do that, we give the terrorists more gain than they could have ever possibly imagined, because we need to, at a time like this, we really need to stay a strong democracy and just have faith in those principles that have gotten us to this point and position in the world.
Tom Gaziano, there is a tendency at times like this for people to say, come on, you got to support the home team. There is a tendency to wave the flag. There is a tendency to equate external expressions of patriotism with genuine patriotism, and sometimes, as I think you'll agree, the expression of dissent is the highest form of patriotism. But let me hear your views.
Oh, that's absolutely correct. And there have been many abuses of civil liberties in our wars, several that have been already mentioned in this program and others that I could recite. And I tell you, I cherish the freedom of speech. I think this program is great because it helps expose the distinction between, silly speech that is mildly offensive and truly offensive speech like Susan Sontag's. So you're doing us a great service.
Perhaps, Susan, you would respond to the larger question that I raised, having to do with, is there at a time like this any point whatsoever in limiting beyond what is commonly limited expressions of dissent?
No. I think that our strength is in dissent, our strength is in diversity. And I think that most people do feel this. Listen, I actually am not totally shocked even by this kind of hysteria, and because people are wounded. I'm wounded. I'm incredibly depressed by this event. And I think that there's a lot of grief masquerading as a show of unanimity. And I think I'm actually rather optimistic that the debate will in fact continue. And I take courage from remarks like those delivered by Senator Byrd. Good for him. There needs to be more debate. There needs to be more consideration of the historical circumstances behind the rise of this evil international movement.
Ed Gillespie, you get the last word.
Well, Ted, I think that emotions are clearly running high in the country right now, and this September 11 terrorist attack, I do think, has had an effect wherein I think moral relativism has come into question. People do think there is right and there is wrong. Susan spoke in terms of good and evil, and I think what you're seeing with the public is an overwhelming preponderance of people who believe the terrorist attack was an evil act. That we're on the side of right in terms of protecting our freedoms, and people may take umbrage at those who dissent from that perspective, but thank God in this country they'll still be able to express that view.
I'm afraid we are out of time, but I'd like to thank all of you for coming in. Susan Sontag, Todd Gaziano, Ed Gillespie, Tom Gutting. I very much appreciate your coming in. Thank you. When we come back, a Nightline fact check on what the President's press secretary really said. It sounded just a little nasty, even alarming. Here was the President's press secretary, R.A. Fleischer, being asked at a White House briefing about Bill Maher's comment, especially the part about the U.S. having been the cowards for lobbing cruise missiles from 2,000 miles away. The part of Fleischer's response that got most of the attention was this, quote, "The reminder is to all Americans that they need to watch what they say," end quote. Well, here's the fact check. Earlier in that same briefing, Fleischer had been asked about the comment of Republican Congressman John Cooksey of Louisiana, who said, as John Donvan reported earlier, "I don't care what their race is or religion is, but I can tell you this, if I see someone that comes in with a diaper on his head and a fan belt around that diaper, that guy needs to be pulled over and checked," end quote. What did the President think about that? Fleischer had been asked. And it was in the context of both those comments, Cooksey's and Bill Maher's, that R.A. Fleischer gave this response, quote, "I'm aware of the press reports about what he, Maher, said. I had not seen the actual transcript of the show itself, but assuming the press reports are right, it's a terrible thing to say. And it's unfortunate. And that's why there was an earlier question about, has the President said anything to people in his own party? That would be the reference to Cooksey. The reminder is," Fleischer went on, "to all Americans that they need to watch what they say, watch what they do, and this is not a time for remarks like that. It never is." Seen in its entirety, in context, it does not sound like a warning from the White House or a threat. R.A. Fleischer got a bum rap on that one. And that's our fact check and our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
This has been a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.